Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name's Charlie from GRC World Forums, and the topic for today's webinar is Dynamic Data Discovery as the foundation of your privacy program. If you do have any questions, then please submit them using the Q&A tab, which you can find on the left-hand side of your screen, and we will aim to answer these throughout and at the end of the presentation. This webinar is also being recorded and will be made available on demand. Finally, we will also be running polls in today's webinar, so make sure to get involved with those as they come up. Joining us on today's webinar, we have Jonathan Joseph, the Head of Solutions at Ketch, and Robert Cunningham, the Head of Legal also from Ketch. So welcome to both of you and thank you for joining us today. I would now like to hand this over to Jonathan, first of all, to start us off with today's webinar.
Hey Charlie, thanks a lot, and thanks everybody for joining. From what I understand, this is one of the last webinars of the year. So Robert, one of the things I was thinking of is this the holiday edition of the Data Discovery webinar? We should probably think about that. But seriously, thank you all for joining us. I lead Solutions and Marketing at Ketch. We're talking about data discovery, and we call it dynamic because the game's changed in data discovery. It used to be intensely manual. It's now automated. We'll talk about that. But I think even more importantly, data discovery as a foundation of your privacy program is what we'll unpack today, and where you can drive value from data discovery being integrated into privacy processes, and why it's so important, and just more broadly, why it's so important to embrace kind of data control as you're thinking about privacy and security use cases. But Robert, over to you. I'm so glad to be doing this webinar with you, one of the last of this year. So thank you for joining us.
We're looking forward to it. Thanks for kicking us off, Jonathan. So I'm Robert Cunningham. As mentioned, I'm the Head of Legal at Ketch. As Jonathan suggested, this is the holiday edition, so you can see why we're dressed so festively in black and white. Clearly, we're in the spirit. I am a privacy lawyer by specialty, GDPR, California law, et cetera, et cetera. I think we all know these laws are expanding. And let's go ahead and get into the meat of what we're here to talk about today. So we'll move to the next slide. So first of all, we are from Ketch, and Ketch is a data control platform for programmatic privacy, governance, and security. And we're based in the San Francisco Bay Area, but like many businesses today, we are dispersed around the country in who we are. And we were just named a cool vendor by Gartner for 2021. So we're really excited about that. And what we're showing you here today is really about data discovery and the new, better ways to do it. Not necessarily Ketch specific, but these are just good ideas that you need to understand to be doing privacy right, in our opinion. And we'll let you know when we're talking about something that's more about Ketch than something general. So we're excited to have you all here, and we look forward to spending the next hour or so with you. We are going to start things off with a poll, and we hope that we'll get some good interaction from you all here. So the poll question is, how good is your data inventory today? First choice, I have a perfect data map. Thank you very much. Secondly, we have a data catalog, but there are gaps. Third, it's the best spreadsheet ever. And fourth, let me get back to you on that. Now, I hope you'll notice that we're using interchangeable terms for what we might call a data inventory, or a systems inventory, or a data dictionary, or a data map. That's not what's important. It's the concept of building your privacy program that matters. So as you're all working through that, we'll just pause for a moment and wait for the results to come in.
It's so fascinating, Robert.
Any good jokes, JJ, that you care to regale us with as we wait for the poll results?
None that I've previously workshopped, Robert. But your point about the synonyms here is important, right? Like data inventory, data mapping, data discovery. Like I don't know if the industry has really settled on a term for that, but broadly using all those terms, we kind of mean the same thing, right? Which we'll unpack today. How do you understand what data you have in your systems, across your systems, specifically, right? Personal and sensitive data is really what we're looking for, even though we're looking to maintain an inventory of that. It looks like some of the results are coming in.
Yeah.
Wow, actually surprised by that. Let me get back to you on that. Is 62%, which is, I guess, I'm surprised it's that high, I would say, right? Because we do talk to a lot of folks who have been managing this with spreadsheets. Microsoft Excel still powering much of the world's economy, which is kind of amazing. But yeah, 62% haven't really gotten started on that, which is super interesting.
And we've got 38% for we have a data catalog, but there are gaps. And that's a pretty fair answer. Let's back up one step. No one has claimed to have a perfect data map, and that might be aspirational for all parties. But to say in a significant percentage that have a data catalog, but there are gaps, we'll talk a fair amount about how you can work hard to eliminate those gaps, whether it's through AI, ML, and other automated processes, or whether there does need to be somebody who has some responsibility for doing a double check to make sure that everything's been covered. So those are good responses. We appreciate you jumping into the poll, and we will move on to the next slide. So this one is a little bit of a, we really mean to deflate some of the anxiety that folks might be feeling by saying that privacy is complexity. If you are responsible for a privacy program and for privacy management at your organization, it is undeniably complex. And there are reasons why we are all confronting this complexity, legitimate reasons. There are proliferating regulations, GDPR, California, add on the industry-specific regulations from financial sectors or healthcare sectors. So that's the law, if you will. Then there are people, right? Your own organization and the many teams that are responsible for privacy or privacy and security or information technology. This crosses many different responsibilities with an organization, which means lots of people can help, but there are also collaboration challenges, undeniably. A further point about the people, Jonathan, is this concept of digital identities. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what we mean there?
Yeah, I find that one fascinating. So we focus a lot on the regulations, right? And this idea that there'll be a 3x increase in the population subject to modern privacy regulation over the next year or so. And so we're focused there from a compliance perspective. I know we're trying to do things better there, right? When GDPR came out and was announced in 2016, live in 2018, it really was, let's do what we can to be compliant, which meant spreadsheets, which meant surveys, which meant kind of all those manual processes. And now people are starting to think about, well, how do I automate that? How are the better ways to kind of build a scalable operation? And of course, on the other side of it is the systems. You're trying to manage these regulations across, on average, 60 applications that an average business has. And in the middle of that is people, and I'm fascinated by the people piece because it's so multidimensional. Like you said, you're dealing with organizational change, right? And kind of managing organizational stakeholders, maybe I should say. Legal, HR, IT, and we have a lot of attendees from those three areas on the call today. Marketing every now and then gets involved. I think should get involved more, given the high kind of consumer experience factor to this. But the other element of people, like you said, is people show up with different roles. They're consumers on the web, but they're employees, and you need to think about how to switch contexts. But also to your point about digital identities, I don't know if the laws have fully, Robert, I'm not a lawyer, but give legal advice freely. So let me know if I've got this wrong here. But the laws talk about protecting people and their data, but people don't show up as people on the web. They show up as these fragmented digital identities, cookies, which are going away, email addresses and whatnot. So stitching that together and coming up with a plan and approach for that, I think, is one of the biggest areas of complexity here. Also one of the least understood. So it's curious how you think about that and how that bridges kind of the regulations and systems on either end there.
One of the catch-22s is that many of the strategies to protect various forms of personal information bring on a lot of complexity. So strategies like maybe not anonymization, which is so hard to achieve, but pseudonymization or tokenization or hashing, some of these other concepts that folks, I believe, are familiar with, at least notionally, make things more difficult and more complex. So in an effort to secure more privacy and more security, we really do start going down a road of expertise being required to do this right. The final point is, I'm sure folks on the call are used to thinking about the difference between being, as a business, being a controller or a processor of data, which has analogs in many other regulations, but are you the primary party responsible, or are you relying on others to help you perform your business activities? And does that change from situation to situation? It is a thorny issue to discern, and it has legal consequences. So that is all to say, JJ, that privacy equals complexity. So let's move to the next slide to keep going down this path. We are all gathered here today, and you showed up to hear about how dynamic data discovery should be the foundation for your privacy program. And of course, we owe you some justification for that claim. And so here on this slide, we're talking about many of the regulations that motivate our claim that you need to do data discovery as a foundational task in your privacy program. Think about the elements of GDPR and a records of processing activities. Where is your data? Where did you get it? What do you have? How do you classify it? Are you sharing it with anyone? Who's responsible for it? Where does it go around the world? The entire issue of transfers, et cetera. All very complicated stuff that you can't achieve unless you've got that forensic or hygienic view of all your data. There are new categories that you'll need to classify. For example, CPRA brings up sensitive personal information that was previously in GDPR, but it's new for California. That's going to be a challenge. What sensitive personal information do you have and where? Back to GDPR, we've got transfer impact assessments, post Schrems 2. How do you do those if you don't have a good handle on your data and where it's going? Keep going. Data protection impact assessments, or more generally, privacy impact assessments. Many laws require this, not just starting with GDPR, but this is going to be an element of CPRA, as well as the Colorado law and the Virginia law, and presumably many of the others that follow along. Finally, it's an incomplete list, but an illustrative list. We've got cybersecurity audits, the form of which is still very much in the air under CPRA, but we do know that it's going to be a requirement that it has yet to take shape. All of these are reasons why having a foundational understanding of your data, where it is, where it's moving, how it's classified, will be key to getting these things right. And we're not the only ones who think this. JJ, if you take us into the next slide, we've got some information about some others who corroborate this.
Yeah, so this is one way to think about the world, Robert. You know, we talk about data control. What is that exactly? You know, we're talking about how to control at a cell attribute level, right? Pieces of data that you have. Imbue them with privacy choices that consumers have made so that you can unpack all those privacy use cases that you'll talk about shortly. And it's starting to come through, I think, and we've got some examples here where that is starting to come through in the analyst community. So I love, you know, Forrester in their latest privacy management wave talks about, look, you're managing and monitoring personal data, right? And it's happening across all environments, it's happening across all these applications. So they're anticipating this demand for data discovery software, and it's a broad lens there, right? We say data discovery, we also mean the classification of data. And how do you figure out what types of data you have? Is it sensitive? Is it personal? What type of data and which data is subject to different regulations, right? You're managing that complexity. And the interesting addition to that is the enforcement of security controls. And there's a lot of aspects to that, but really, you know, they're talking about data in use cases. And when you're accessing data, as an example, you should be able to define policy that determines how that data gets surfaced. So does it need to be masked? Does it need to be anonymized? In addition to that, you've identified specific processing purposes, right? Like under GDPR, they call it purpose limitation. How does that translate into an access request? You know, that, and I don't mean a GSR access request, I mean somebody within the organization accessing data. So it starts to really morph into all these broader ideas that start to include security. And we see this arc where we comply, we control data at a granular level, and we mean, you know, things like access. And then we're securing data, right? We're reducing the data footprint where possible, you know, data minimization under GDPR. We're minimizing the risk of data being exfiltrated out of the business and whatnot. And so security starts to become a bigger piece of this. Forrester said as well in that same study that, you know, solutions out there are somewhat limited in security. So the world is moving out there, expect a whole lot more. Gartner as well, right? They talk about it through the lens of the data lifecycle. So you've got this data life cycle from when you've collected data to when data ends its life, right? So there's a retention period, and you're defining these retention periods. And Robert, one of the things you and I have talked about a lot is, what does that mean in the context of a deletion request or a request for erasure? Like, what do you delete? What don't you delete? How do you navigate that? And so this idea that data discovery is part of, I would say, a core privacy use case like that, I think is important. Back in 2018, we were just deleting data, right? We weren't around in 2018, but that's the 2018 approach. And today it's really about, and kind of back to the point that we made earlier, that we struggled to comply. The world struggled to comply in 2018. They did what they needed to do. And today they're thinking about it a little more purposefully. And I think an example of that is when you do a deletion request, there are parts that you need to keep and there's data that you need to delete. And how do you manage that, and what's subject to different retention rules and whatnot. And data discovery, having a way to think about that, have it be automated rather than sitting in a spreadsheet, I think is core to that.
JJ, to nuance that a little bit on the data discovery point, there are elements that you need to delete. There are elements that you need to keep, as you say. There's also a middle ground of data that you'd like to keep, and you'd like to invoke the various exemptions and exceptions that are available under these laws. These laws do have quite voluminous options if you have the appropriate justification to preserve data for various use cases. The problem is, if you don't have the granularity of the knobs and dials in your system to be able to achieve that, then you're left with a binary choice between delete and keep, and they are both over-inclusive. So we're talking about systems that can bring enough control at a granular enough level to enable not just compliance, but utility. Not just compliance, but value.
Yeah, so well said, Robert. Hey, Robert, we have a question in the chat. I'm not sure if you want to address it now, or maybe we're addressing it later. Should data governance policies, and by the way, folks, if happy to take questions all the way through this. If we're getting to it later, we'll let you know. But should data governance policies be closely linked in their implementation and relief response to identified risks? Not to put you on the spot, Robert, but.
So I think that actually is a nice follow-on to the point I just made. And I would say the answer is yes, to the extent you can, right? And that kind of linkage, that kind of call it, sort of a privacy or a security use case for your data governance policies is what we're trying to achieve here. You're not just knowing where your data is so you can say you know where your data is, but you're implementing policies that are responsive to risks. And a little bit like what I said with respect to these laws offering exemptions and exceptions for data deletion, they are to a certain extent risk-based approaches. Safeguards need to be appropriate and reasonable for the risk. Certain types of data need to be kept secure enough or for the level of risk to which they're exposed. So to the questioner, I think the answer is yes. And it's something that's hard to achieve manually in the design of your policies. And we and others can help with that. Thanks, Robert. And thank you for the question. So look, the analyst community is there. I think we're all there. If we move to the next slide, please. The regulators are there, right? The regulators are. This one's hot off the presses. Just published in the Federal Register, I believe, last week. So the clock is ticking on this. But those of you who are joining us from the financial services industry are likely familiar with the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which governs financial services in the United States of America. And the amended safeguards rule, so there's been a safeguards rule for the safeguarding of customer personal information under that law for many years. And there's an amended rule that just came out that explicitly requires, as you can see in this quote here, what they refer to as a systems inventory. And that inventory needs to give you a clear picture of your systems and the data contained within those systems. So this is a regulatory requirement that is new and is not something that businesses necessarily have been doing. And if they had been doing it, there would have been many, many gaps as reflected in our polling. The other wrinkle here, JJ, is that this is something that is relatively prescriptive in place of a rule that used to be a little bit more principles-based. This is a shift toward, at least in this case, the federal regulators saying, we left it up to you all to implement our suggestions for a while, and now we are going to become a lot more prescriptive about what needs to be done. An example of that being the requirement to have the systems inventory, which is yet another synonym for the kind of words we've been throwing around: data discovery, asset map, et cetera.
Right, we've got another question here. Actually, I have the same question. Is this just financial institutions, given its GLBA? And I mean, I'll let you answer, but I think it's broader, but also I think there's some other reasons why this is so important in its potential impact on other legislation, right?
That's right. Part of the rule broadened the definition of financial institutions, arguably past what someone would think as the intuitive answer. So first of all, the FTC's enforcement of this rule is for the world other than banks. So what you might think of as traditional banking institutions are governed. They're governed under different regulations. But we are in the world of, if you're not a bank, all the rest of the world, which is obviously a lot. And here, the FTC has been explicit that they're also capturing any entities that are engaged in activities that are even incidental to financial activities. And one of the ones that they point out are finders, which are the kind of companies that are essentially putting together potential customers and consumers with businesses that provide products that are in the financial services space. So, this can be retail institutions that offer a credit card. This can be tax preparers. It's much broader than you might presume. And as you suggest, JJ, this rule has in the past influenced other requirements within federal jurisdiction. And so even if it is within a broad category of financial institutions today, if the past is any guide to the future, this is going to impact some of the other sectoral laws. So you may find this systems inventory requirement pop up in other locations, whether it be healthcare or you name it.
Gotcha. And this is the FTC, right? I think I read this morning that they're considering rulemaking or started the process for more rulemaking on privacy and AI and algorithmic decision making, and all the more reason to, I think, have a good handle on data you have and how it's being used across your organization, including into machine learning models.
That's right. That's right. So I think we've gone a long way toward justifying our claim that this should be foundational to your program. Let's talk about what that might look like. So let's move on to the next slide here. So here's our suggested framework for what we at Ketch call programmatic privacy. 4 higher level considerations that we would encourage any organization. We're past the limit of financial institutions, just as a reminder. We're back in the world of everybody here. 4 elements that you should consider: understand, decide, engage, and enforce. And we are, to a certain extent, talking about primarily understanding here today: where your data lives, how does it move through your systems, who has access. JJ made the important point, situating us earlier. We're not just talking, and we're not even primarily talking about outsiders like consumers and customers and how they might access their data or make requests to you. We're very much talking about how your own organizations can take advantage of using the data that you have for appropriate purposes: data science, analytics, whatever it might be. So when we say things like access, we mean privacy regulatory access for data subject requests, but we also mean using data inside an organization in an appropriate way with limited access. Then you need to decide, right? You need to have policies around your data use, or at least you're likely to have policies around your data use. They need to be kept securely, and they need to work. They need to limit access, and they need to reflect the judgment of your organization as it has interpreted relevant regulation, wherever that regulation might come from as it relates to your business. Then you need to engage. We are turning now back to consumers of the privacy program. What do I mean by that? I mean potentially your customers who come to your website or your mobile application, potentially your employers, who of course have fulsome rights as well. Maybe it's your partners and your business partners who help you do things, contractors, sub-processors, et cetera. Finally, you need to enforce all of this. You need to make sure that you're not just offering disclosure around privacy and security, that you are actually following through. you are enforcing those policies within your systems. This can involve a lot of security technology as well. If we have time, we'll talk about that to a certain degree. So this is some level setting of 4 pillars of an effective programmatic privacy journey as we see it at Ketch. And if we move to the next slide, I think JJ is going to take us through a little bit more detail in each of these areas.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. And McKinsey and other management consulting firms will be proud, I think, of your 4-step process there. One of the, but let's get down to the check that actually makes that work. But the other point I wanted to make is, we position understand as this first thing that you do, but I think one of the things we want to unpack today is it's not just the first thing. It's integrated into the rest of the process. And I think we'll give some examples of how that is. And indeed, decide is integrated, right? You're deciding policies that govern how you engage with consumers. You're deciding on policies that govern what needs to be enforced in service provider systems, but also in your own systems in terms of access and security. And so that's kind of, keep that in mind, that a lot of this is interoperable, if you will. So the understand layer is in a nutshell your data discovery and classification. How do you connect to your data systems and across your data systems, and including, by the way, data that is in service provider systems, to understand what's there and to be able to adequately label what's sensitive, what's personal, and even to go a layer beneath that. What's sensitive based on this particular law, and what's personal based on this other law, and how to use it across different contexts. And we'll talk about how the game's changed there a little bit, but you can start to see that automation here, even though we haven't, I think, fully achieved the holy grail of 100% automation in this space. I don't think we want to, by the way. I think there's elements of the manual here, especially when it comes to labeling, that humans are just always going to be better at. So, we don't want to say that there's 100% automation here. It's a whole lot more automated, but there's still some work that humans need to do, and I think we're all the better for it. So that's the focus of today. But just to highlight some of the other pieces here, your decide layer is the central location to determine policy. And when I say policy, I mean, what's your response to GDPR? How do you define processing purposes? How do you define what a consumer sees when they appear on your website or mobile apps or television, or as the case may be? And that decide layer, you're setting privacy policy, but you're also setting data governance policy. So from that central location, you're determining, well, who has access to data within my organization based on those processing purposes that I identified for GDPR, as an example, and a whole raft of other data governance concepts, which includes security. So we talked a little about what form does the data need to take when people are accessing it? When does it need to be tokenized? When does it need to be masked? The FTC example that we talked about this morning, one of the reasons why they're looking into AI and algorithmic decision-making is to eliminate bias that can happen in those models. So how do you decide on an approach that helps you avoid bias? Techniques like differential privacy and whatnot. And so all that happens in a policy cell like that. One of the things to look for is this idea that data can stay where it is. Data can remain decentralized in your systems. And I think this is an important point for data discovery. What you see a lot, and we'll talk about this, is data being exfiltrated out of your systems. And basically parallel data lakes being created for the purposes of deciding policy. And what we're seeing kind of in the latest iteration of this technology here is that you don't need to do that. The policy making can stay centralized, and the data can stay decentralized. And I think that's music to the ears of a lot of security professionals, right, who don't wish to manage a whole other raft of data moving across the internet into another cloud, as an example. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. The engage layer, I think we're familiar with, right? This is your classic consent and preference management. But the people complexity that we talked about earlier is key here. How do we engage people as people rather than devices? And it's more than just stitching those devices together. It's being aware that consent has come from a specific person and can be applied across devices, but also understanding that is important as you enforce a lot of the policies that you've set. And so, as an example, we call one part of privacy enforcement orchestration. And what we mean by that is a consumer has made a privacy choice. They made a privacy choice based on what you've asked of them to provide consent on, opt-in or opt-out or whatever the case may be, and they've given you that choice. And now that choice needs to filter through across all the systems that you use, both internally and with external service providers. And Robert, I'm keen to kind of explore your thoughts here as well, because we've talked about this, right? Where does the obligation, where does it end? It's like we used to deal with this contractually, this idea that a brand or a controller would get a consumer's privacy signal, but they'd be working with a service provider, a CRM provider, whatever the case may be. And that relationship was contractual, right? Hey, if I send you this privacy choice, you should update it in the systems. Is that, still the case?
I think if there are any other lawyers like myself on the call here, I imagine there are, you've had to negotiate these paragraphs in data processing addenda that say, the controller mandates something exceptional from the processor to under their GDPR obligations to help them deal with data subject requests. The processor might negotiate hard back and say, you're asking for more than the law requires. There's only so much I can do to help you with an access request or a rectification request. And there's a lot of back and forth about that. And it's all very contractual. And at the end of the day, folks are left wondering, does any of this matter anyway if we don't have technology around it? It is pretty clear under the law that it's joint and several liability. Might start with the controllers, but the processors certainly need to help. When you have technology, when you have software that can give you confidence in your ability to fulfill these requests, it changes that whole contracting process. It renders it a little bit moot, other than the requirement to have these contracts in place. The negotiation can take on a totally different tenor, and a processor can say to a controller, hey, no problem. I have a system whereby I am able to use sophisticated technology to respond to your requests. And instead of sending emails back and forth from DPA at controller to DPA at processor.com, we can use actual software systems to delete data in situ or to pull data access from the location where it resides securely and not put things into emails. That is all to say that the technical world is catching up with the obligations that these laws have put on the controller processor or business service provider relationship. And to the point about identity, as with many of the folks I presume joining us on the call here, there are a lot of languages out there in the world among peoples, and there are a lot of languages between systems. Salesforce identifies contact records in a different way with a different identifier than their customers might. And every system has its own way of doing things. And it's important that your technology be able to translate among these various systems. It is not legitimate to tell the regulator we were unable to respect privacy rights because we didn't know what language they were speaking. I mean that in the literal and sort of metaphorical technical sense. You need to be able to translate between a request that comes in from a certain type of system and translate it to a system that you have chosen to be relying on. That is something that is an onus on these controllers and processors.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. I think that's the promise of programmatic privacy, right? And there's so much more that comes when the ecosystem behaves in that way, where privacy is just built in and these things just start to happen. I think it was another quote from Gartner that said, brands that lead the way in that kind of enforcement will participate in more of these data ecosystems where trust is cornerstone. And it's like the internet. We don't know where that's going to go, and we don't know what kind of use cases and value that's going to bring, but it's going to bring value, right? And I think especially when we get more AI and machine learning operating in machine-to-machine communications, you have to have trust embedded in that system, and it's going to be almost impossible to manage manually. I see there's another question there on the understand level. Thanks for that, Paul. Are humans needed? Comments tied to classification or both discovery and classification within understand? And the answer to that is yes, absolutely. So there's a way to do it where it's fully automated, basically a machine learning model that can see data and label it. This looks like a social security number. I'm going to classify it as such. or classify it as personal and sensitive. But also, I think there's some manual intervention there as well, right? So humans jumping in and saying, well, either the machines may have got that wrong, or we think about that differently, and we're classifying it as X. It's all part of that. I think 100% automation there, we're not there, and at least across our clients, they prefer a level of, well, I need to be able to change the label if I need to. Excuse me. Thanks for that question. All right, well, let's roll into data discovery a little deeper here. So, I feel like we're highlighting a lot of challenges here, Robert. So let's get to the solutions. So this is the last challenges slide, but basically, data discovery and the way that it was done, totally unworkable. Totally unworkable when you think about the complexities that you kind of highlighted, Robert, around regulations, people, and systems. Imagine a spreadsheet, data discovery spreadsheet in the middle of that, or it's kind of, as you pointed out in our prep, it's interviews, right? It's calling people across your organization and emailing them and saying, hey, what systems do you use and what kind of data is in there? Can you send me some examples? And just imagine I don't know if you have more examples there, Robert, but it just seems to me to be a crazy thing. It's up there.
Well, the other problem is if your big survey questionnaire meeting was on Monday and the data was in such a state on Monday, what about Wednesday? and what about Friday? And we don't mean to imply that prior technology was stupid. We mean to imply that there wasn't much prior technology to get this right, and that now there are ways to do this better. But it is not going to be scalable or accurate, and accuracy certainly is an obligation. It's not going to be scalable or accurate to rely on meetings with your colleagues and spreadsheets that people complete, to the extent they're even collaborative, to get the kind of clear picture that, for example, the FTC is asking you to have of your data and systems inventory. As I said, what about Friday if you started on Monday? You're going to have a standing meeting every 3 days to make sure that you've checked in with all of your data sources. That's going to be unpopular.
Yeah, to say the least. And I love a good spreadsheet, Robert, but it's just incredibly crazy.
You do.
So manual, time intensive, and kind of, as you rightly said, static and incomplete almost, the very next day, given how quickly things change. And you don't have any confidence that you've picked up every data set through a survey like that, let alone changes that are made after you've completed your survey and you have a nifty little spreadsheet. But then thirdly, I think, and this is kind of looking ahead a little more, it's like to have that integrated into your privacy management, I think, is key. To programmatically apply regulations, but also, I think we'll talk about this in a second, doing a DSR, right? Doing a roadblock. Like, how much easier is that when you have, these data attributes at your fingertips? And then, to your point on number 4 here, it's not that the technology was no good. It was just that it didn't really exist, right? The technology was Microsoft Excel. But there are some solutions that have come about recently. And I think what we're trying to see, at least what we hear, is they're kind of presenting more problems than they're solving for. So as an example, creating a parallel data lake for privacy use cases. You don't need to do that. Pulling out personal data outside of the systems that exist at brands so that you can apply privacy use cases, but now you've got personal data in another system. You don't need to do that. This idea, and I think a lot
of JJ, you don't want to do that. All of these operations, because you and I are so obviously technically savvy, tongue in cheek there, these operations cost money, right? Parallel data lake, that's more storage. Exfiltration is transfer and processing. These are real operations that at a certain scale begin to be very expensive. So there's also efficiency gain that needs to be factored in to these technologies. Never mind the human time spent, which is outrageous, but the actual compute power and storage needs to be rationed as well, and save budget for things that are a lot more meaningful and responsive to your business's success.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, security folks are jumping into this conversation. It's more collaborative as they try to solve for privacy. And I'm sure they just love the idea of data being pulled out of their system and placed into
Right.
another one. Yeah. All right. Well, let's roll into some solutions here. So the first one. So this idea that data discovery was manual and time intensive. Instead of surveys, you can now connect with technology. So that includes connecting to all these service provider systems, which hasn't been something that I would say the software in this space is kind of doing. They're focused on internal systems, and there is some of those complexities involved there. And actually, good little question there. It's really our last slide. The reason why a lot of organizations are using manual data discovery is to reduce cost, and it's a case of finding a balance, right? And I think such a great point. And Robert, I think what we're saying is now the balance is skewed to a little more automation, right? And a little more reduction of cost and a little more, I would say, driving efficiency and effectiveness of privacy use cases, which we'll talk about in a second. So yeah, thank you for that. So yeah, this idea that you can connect to service provider systems, you can do that via APIs, and it's always on, and there's a back and forth, I think is important, but also into your internal systems, right? This idea that you can now have visibility into the data that you have across your systems. And when I say visibility, to the point about not exfiltrating data, one of the, I think, the novel innovations in this space is that you can pull out attribute level data. And what I mean by that is, for example, when you look into the Ketch platform, where we would say there's social security numbers or postal addresses in that database, but we're not showing you those numbers. We're just giving you the attributes, right? The labels, which I think is important. You can make decisions on those labels without having that data having left that system. So I think that's an important point, important clarification here. But Rob, would you add anything to this? I mean, for me, it's to having a marketplace where you can connect to any system that you have, including your internal ones, seems to be the key here.
And it's not just the existence of this capability that a platform can offer, Ketch offers. It's the ease of use, right? I am a privacy lawyer. I need to be able to navigate these systems with my level of technical acumen, which is not extreme, to say the least. And so I need to be able to say, I need to at least understand the relationship between my organization and, say, Snowflake or Google. And I need to be able to understand what these tabs and what these integrations are telling me. And I potentially need to be able to set them up myself to drive the kind of efficiency that we've been talking about. So this needs to be a capability, and it needs to be designed starting with UX and UI in a way that someone like me can use it.
Yeah, this connect layer, by the way, is one of the most expensive and difficult to solve from a data governance perspective. So trying to add on to the point that was made in the comments here, this is one of the things where you can have connections like this with systems that reduces the need for manual data discovery, but also I think gives you the reduction in costs that you're looking for through these automated processes. And I love what you're saying earlier, Robert, about we're dealing with different languages here. I mean, you see Facebook, you see Amplitude, you see Amazon here, just to pick off some of the names here. Each one of those has a different way to communicate, right? A different language. And so part of solving for this problem is having those APIs, those pipes that connect into those and speak the language that the receiving end speaks, if you will, so that you can speak privacy at a Tower of Babel, if you would, or a Rosetta Stone for privacy. So I think what's key to this.
That's right.
All right, so let's go to challenge number 2. So static and incomplete. And so this is the benefit that you get to dig into one example here, which is Snowflake. To see data at an attribute level like this, at a very granular kind of row, columns, cell level, be able to manage those labels back to that point that somebody made, humans needed. You can manage those labels here in addition to what the machine learning models have come up with, and you can check those. And as new attributes get added on into that database, they start to pop up here, and they pop up with their new labels. And this is kind of what we mean by always on. So this idea that you have a static and incomplete data discovery spreadsheet or whatnot, I think that's no longer something that needs to happen.
And it's simply not effective nor is it likely going to be compliant to have to rely on some sort of human vigilance to know that a team has added a new data asset or that a new data element has been populated in that data asset. This is the kind of thing that technology is good at. Technology might not be good at everything. It's not necessarily a panacea, but this, 24/7, 365 vigilance at a technical level is something you should use software for. And then even if it just pops up and says, hey, you've added a new data asset, Robert Cunningham, please take a look. That's fine. That's still efficient. But you can't have the weekly check-in and say, hey, everybody, bring your list of new data assets. That's not going to work.
It's not a meeting I'd want to be at. By the way, Robert, thank you for saying panacea, because I was playing Robert Webinar Bingo, and I needed that to complete the row, so I appreciate that. All right, let's go to number 3. This one's one of my favorites, Robert, but I'll let you talk about it.
Yeah, this is the concept that you are doing this data discovery, and I'll throw out the synonyms again: the systems inventory, this data map, this data dictionary, this catalog. You're doing it for a reason, and those reasons, at least since in the past 5 years in particular, are privacy obligations, whether they're legal obligations or generating a more trusting relationship with your customers and consumers. That's not to say that there isn't a good reason to know where your data is just because. There certainly is. A modern data-driven business or organization should have a handle on what data they have, what data they collect, where it is, if only to take appropriate advantage of that data. But call these privacy cases a new sort of knockout reason to definitely have a better handle on your data. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the ability to fulfill data subject requests for access or deletion or rectification. We're talking about the ability to ask consumers for the appropriate consent or to get their legitimate interest legal basis, whatever it might be, and then to be able to store and manage that within your systems because you know where that data is. This is the data that I received under legitimate interest. This is the data that I received under contractual necessity, but that now has changed and I need to update the data. These are privacy use cases that are relatively new, and you need to be empowered to respond to them in conjunction with your data systems and your data inventory. So there's a reason that you're doing it now, and maybe that's a good way to even get budget to do these things. You're looking for solutions that can solve those problems. Here's one of those solutions. That's what has changed. Another example that I just saw on the screen here, email marketing. Well, everyone kept a list of all the emails that they sent these email campaigns to because that's how you manage the email campaigns. But now you need to be able to manage the opt-outs in a much more significant fashion than just an unsubscribe link in those emails. So these are all use cases that depend on a more advanced data discovery and data inventory capability.
Yeah, the Roper dashboard that we're seeing there kind of behind the DSR screen, when we ask our clients, what would you do with this? That seems to be, these are here because these are the top use cases, right? I want more granularity in responding to a data subject request, what to delete, what not to delete at an attribute level. And then secondly, I'm building Ropers and I don't want to do that in a spreadsheet. I want the data, the processing purposes at my fingertips, and I want it to be, even though you can press a button and have it produce the artifact you need for compliance, to have this be always on and in a system like this, I think is, at least from the Ketch perspective, the top 2 use cases on when we ask people, what would you do with data discovery integrated into privacy management?
Imagine a brave new world, which we are creating today, that enables a responsible privacy professional like myself to say, oh, I need to produce my record of processing activities today, right now, comprehensive and credible. And I pull up a page within my system, or I press a button and it is there, and it is dynamic, and it is up to date, and it's comprehensive. Whether you need to show that to a regulator, heaven forbid, or whether you just want to get the lay of the land of what you're doing from a data processing and storage perspective, we're making those capabilities automatic and credible and comprehensive in a way that just wasn't possible before. To send a link to a drive, to a Google Drive folder that contains a lot of different documents is not the way to answer these challenges.
Yeah, well said.
No denigration intended of Google Drive, of which I'm a huge fan, but it wasn't built for this purpose. And a lot of what we're talking about today, to be more succinct, JJ and I sometimes struggle with that, is to say technology built for the purpose, the right tool for the right job.
Exactly. I love it. Let's go to the last one. So, and we talked about this a little bit, this idea that, hey, there are some solutions for this, right? They're starting to pop up, but they introduce more complexity than they need to. And they actually introduce a lot of security risks that you may not need to deal with. So the idea is to give folks options. And one of those options is centralized control, decentralized data. Let the data stay where it is. Make decisions in a central policy or decisioning engine that doesn't exfiltrate data, but can still control what happens to that data. And some of the elements of that control you can see on the screen. What we call attribute fortification is what format does that data need to take in an access request or whatnot? Does it need to be masked? Does it need to be tokenized? You know, do you want to be able to use it again or send it into a system where it could be used? Is it something where it's totally anonymized and masked and kind of done so forever? And then also tying that, and this is the holy grail, right, Robert? I've never been quite sure what this is called, but some people call it purpose limitation. Some people call it purpose-based access control. Is that the holy grail here, this idea that you've defined your data processing purposes and now you have it in this live system? And is that the juice? Is that the kind of granular key of which everything else needs to be keyed on, what the purpose of that data collection was?
One thing, the phrase that pops into my mind is data minimization, but that's not quite right, because data minimization is about collecting no more than you need. What this is really describing is using no more than you need, which is intended to be a different project. Your organization, or many organizations, have very smart people who can do amazing things with data scientists, data analysts, data engineers, privacy engineers even. And there are these massive data sets that they have access to, and the temptation is just to download it all and use it all for whatever interesting projects might be available. That's both, again, an overwhelming cost and, more importantly, non-compliant. So what if you only need to see gender and education, but it's really difficult to generate the data set without all that other stuff? Well, Ketch enables you to simply mask out those columns and those rows that you don't need to see or don't want to see. So this is going from a place of bare necessity and compliance to, again, as we've said several times, data utility that is still consistent with privacy obligations. And think of the advantages of not having to harp on your team and train them relentlessly about, hey, don't look at this data, make sure not to access this data. Here there are technical gates that do not rely on some sort of cultural awareness about what's allowed within the organization. They can't see this data because it's hashed, and they can only see the data that they need to see and should see. This is evolution that brings a lot more comfort and then ultimately more utility from the data.
Yeah, Robert, it's so well said. This will change the game in access. You know, when we talk about or ask clients about how employees are accessing data, they're accessing data at a system level. You know, Robert or Rob has access to this system, right? And when they have access to that system, they have access to all the data underpinning it. And what we're saying is, you've done the work on the processing purposes for your privacy program. You've done that work and you've said, this is analytics data, this is personalization data, this is email marketing data. You can use those purposes to then define who gets to look at what. And I think that's the key point, because when you have, and it's usually somebody in an IT organization that has access to every system because they have to. And when they have access to every system, they have access to all the data underneath that system, including what it actually is, right? There's no masking involved when they access that data. And that, of course, creates a weak point. That creates the point of entry for, improper actors.
We keep coming back to this overarching concept of getting away from the binary all or nothing to what we said at the outset, which is data control. If you have the levers, if you have the knobs and dials to pull this off, they are of undeniable value. It's just a question of having them available and being able to use them and having someone who built them, and that's what we've done.
All right, well, we're going to get to a money slide, and but I want to. There's another question here. What's the vision for centralized control managed by the Privacy Office? What are the early adopters of Ketch doing with this? Well, thank you for that question. One of the key things they're solving is the avoiding the exfiltration of data. So let data stay where it is in systems that our clients manage. We don't need to see it. Right? You don't need to see that data in Ketch. You can have control through Ketch, through the Ketch UI, on those data sets without seeing the personal data. In some instances, you have to see it, right? If you're dealing with a data subject request and you have to approve it, as an example, or if there's a labeling exercise. So there's some instances where you do see it, but most of the time, what we're trying to solve for here is let's not create a whole other data lake. Right, and so that's kind of thing one. Thing two, which actually it's on a slide coming up, is people are making investments in cloud environments like Snowflake, and they're looking to optimize those investments. And one of the first areas in which they're doing that is around access. So truly understanding and being able to control who's accessing which data set, and can we minimize that? And actually, let's talk about that on the next slide, because we've got a money slide coming up and we've got a couple of minutes. Okay, so here's where the money is, essentially, when it comes to ROI on these programmatic solutions. I think this answers the question a little bit as well. This idea that data and the uses of data is compatible with compliance, I think, is important. You know, we like to say you can build value while honoring values, and I think it's a concept that's coming up a lot. So this idea that you can control data at a granular level while being, I guess, cognizant is the right word of privacy choices that consumers have made, I think is where we need to go as an industry. Secondly, collapsing all those compliance costs that we've got a lot of questions on. It is cumbersome and expensive to deal with all that complexity that you highlighted at the beginning of the call, Robert. And then, of course, we're not just doing this for the regulators, right? We're doing this because there's a consumers expect it, right? And we're doing this to build brand value and build trust. And especially as we enter a world where there's more AI in decision-making, I think that's going to become more and more important. On the data discovery point, some of those bullets on the left, Rob, you talked about data minimization a few times in the call. This idea that you can understand what your data surface area looks like, and then understand which data you're using and what you're not, and be able to reduce that, I think is important. And to the question that was asked in the chat, you could be reducing 20 to 30% of your data surface area, which is important for risk, but it's also important for storage costs. You know, I was amazed by how expensive it is to store data. 700 grand per petabyte per year in storage. So being able to reduce footprints of data that you're not using, I think is going to be important there. And of course, as you reduce that surface area, the risk of a data breach decreases. And if you can control access, right? We talked about access at a system level. Now we're moving to access at a data level. And that access at a data level combined with this idea that you can change how the data appears, I think reduces the risk of what data looks like in a data breach and the risk of data breach itself. And then Robert, you kind of highlighted a lot of these, all the use cases that run through privacy. This just makes it more efficient, more effective.
Yeah, and on that final point, as we look at some of the customers who have taken this journey with us, a lot of this work that these technologies like Ketch are getting rid of was uninteresting, frustrating work. Let the data scientists do data science instead of worry about whether they're looking at permitted data. Let the privacy professionals solve hard problems instead of setting up rules for the data scientists that they have to keep vigilance over, right? Empower employees and satisfy employees to do the work that's interesting to them, and have technology solve some of these more mundane considerations and solve them faster and solve them better.
Well said, Robert. I think we'll end on that. I don't know how this happened because we didn't practice this webinar, but we're like right on the money. This is the last slide. There's 30 seconds left. So I appreciate doing this with you.
It was more importantly, we hope the audience enjoyed it as much as we did. And there's a slide that tells you where to find us if you so choose.
Yeah, I just want to come in and say a big thank you to you both for a very insightful discussion and actually weaving in those audience questions throughout as well. So just a final reminder for those who are asking in the chat, the webinar has been recorded and will be made available on demand. So you'll get details sent to you via email, and it'll be published on the GRC World Forums website as well. So on behalf of GRC World Forums and our panel, thank you and have a great morning, afternoon or evening, wherever you are in the world. So thanks for joining us and goodbye.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you.